Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The Disappearing Camper. Back in the 1990s, my Uncle Charles worked as a sheriff's deputy and search and rescue officer in the forests of the northwestern United States. He told me this story from his time working there. He asked me to keep the exact location a secret, so I won't be able to tell you that. It was the summer of 1992. It had been a couple of years since my uncle started his job. Summers were always busy. Many people came to the area to go camping. Naturally, sometimes people would get lost. Search and rescue calls were common. My uncle had been assigned to the search and rescue team as a rookie and learned to love it. He loved being able to help people, especially in life or death situations. Search and rescue calls were exciting compared to his normal shift. Usually, his job was mundane in the small town. One Tuesday morning, the station received a call from a woman in Arizona. She claimed her husband and son had driven up to the forest on a Friday for a weekend camping trip. They had not returned on Monday as scheduled, and she was worried. The search and rescue team got ready to go out and look for them. The team consisted of my uncle, 4 other deputies, 15 civilian volunteers, and 2 bloodhound dogs. They made it to the family's campsite around noon. Upon first inspection, everything at the camp seemed normal. The team searched the family's tent and found their belongings inside, undisturbed. The truck keys, wallet, map, water, and food were all in the tent. There was a small pot filled with water and soggy macaroni above the fire pit. It was obvious that they had left in a hurry. There were no tracks visible to determine what direction the family went, so the team used socks found in the tent to give the hounds a base scent. The hounds caught the scent and started leading the team north of the campsite. My uncle looked at his partner and both lowered their heads. North of the campsite was tens of thousands of acres of dense woods. They knew this was going to be a long search. They started searching in a grid pattern. This was roughly an acre-sized square on the map that the search and rescue team used to determine a more precise direction that someone might have gone. The weirdest part was that the hounds would pick up the one family's scent in one square, but not in any of the squares directly next to that square. This happened multiple times. It was as if someone too removed the family from their campsite and placed them in random sections of the forest repeatedly. My uncle started to get a bad feeling. Something just didn't seem right about the situation. The team covered roughly 3 miles as the day started to wind down. As dusk began to fall, it was just my uncle, his buddy Justin, and Justin's hound Duke who stayed behind. The rest of the team made their way back home. My uncle always stayed out overnight when a child was lost. He had a feeling of guilt being in a warm, safe bed while a child was cold and scared out in the wilderness. They eventually found a small clearing to make camp. By the time night fell, they had a fire blazing and their sleeping bags laid out in the grass. Justin and my uncle went over the next day's search plan for a bit, ate dinner, and eventually hunkered down for the evening. My uncle lay on his sleeping bag and quickly dozed off. He woke up sometime later and sat up. He looked around as his eyes began to adjust to the darkness. He felt like someone was watching him. The urge to look around to ensure that no one was sneaking up on him was intense. He called out, "Hello, Jake. Are you out there? We're looking for you." There was no response, so my uncle lay down and tried to go back to sleep. Just a few minutes later, he heard it. Somewhere to the left past the tree line came a loud wolf whistle. He sprang up out of his sleeping bag and frantically scanned the tree line. At this point, Duke was up too. His ears were perked, and he was whining in the direction of the whistle. My uncle called out again, "Hello, I'm an officer with the sheriff's department. Do you need help, Jake?" He got no response. Justin was awake now, and as my uncle was explaining the situation, the whistle came again, but this time to the right. My uncle drew his weapon and flicked on his flashlight as Justin stood beside him with his buck knife. They scanned the tree line, but they didn't see anything. They continued searching and calling out for another 10 minutes before deciding to get the fire going again and wait until dawn to search the area. They didn't hear another whistle for the remainder of the night. As dawn broke, Justin and my uncle searched the area. They found boot prints in the mud. They decided to head back home, get some rest, and return later in the day to continue searching. They were only about 200 feet from the clearing when two simultaneous wolf whistles came from behind them. As my uncle turned, he scanned the trees. He didn't see anything at first, but as he looked farther back towards the entrance to the clearing, he saw two silhouettes standing out in the open. They couldn't see any features or clothing as the morning sun was blinding. My uncle called out and started making his way towards them when they took off running. He was going to chase them when Justin stopped him. My uncle was puzzled. "Justin, we are looking for two people, and there they are. Stop wasting time." Justin replied, "Stop and think for a second. We are looking for one male adult and one male child. Unless this kid is the next Usain Bolt, there is no way that he is that tall at age 11. That's when the realization hit my uncle. Justin was right. Those two silhouettes were not the two people they were searching for. If he had been alone or with another deputy, he would have chased them, but he wasn't willing to put a civilian volunteer in danger. They decided to just continue their way back to the trailhead and debrief the team and sheriff on the events that had transpired. The rest of the hike back was uneventful. When they arrived, the search team and sheriff were getting geared up to head back out. They received a few scoffs and eye rolls when retelling the events that occurred, but the sheriff surprisingly believed their claims. He even had one of the deputies carry an M16 for the remainder of the search. The team continued their search for 13 days. They never found the missing man and child. A few people claimed to hear wolf whistles while out searching, but my uncle never did again. This mission still haunts my uncle. He has wondered all these years what happened to the missing family and if the two silhouettes that he saw had something to do with their disappearance. Nighttime visitor. When I was around 17 or 18 years old, my sister, Julie, was 20 or 21. We lived in a small valley that wasn't known for being dangerous, although there had been some criminal activity reported in the town. We had been walking around the valley during the day and night for years and never encountered anything that made us feel unsafe. The incident occurred on our elementary school's campus. The campus had one building, two playgrounds, and two fields. The school grounds were enclosed by a fence. There was a small side street outside the fence that led to the main road. The structure we were sitting on was located across from the main building and was on the edge of the gravel field. Below the structure was that soft material that's made out of wood chips, like the kind that's found at the bottom of playgrounds. My sister and I have always been close. We loved spending time together. We would regularly go on walks around our neighborhood late at night, especially in the summer. We would often end up at our local elementary school's playground to play on the swings and other structures. One summer night, as usual, we walked to one of our local grocery stores to grab some snacks and drinks. Then we walked to the school and sat on the swings at the playground. My sister and I talked and laughed about normal things when I heard what sounded like something hard dropping from the sky onto the gravel a little ways in front of us. I didn't think much of it at first. I knew that it wasn't rain or any natural substance you would expect to fall from the sky. After a short while, it happened again. This time, whatever it was closer than before. That's when I asked my sister if she heard that. She hadn't noticed the sounds before as she was talking. We both sat in silence for a bit, and then we heard it again. It was even closer now. I started to get a bit scared. Since it was dark and it sounded like whatever was falling was getting closer, I started to get scared. I started to imagine all kinds of things it could be, but none of my thoughts were realistic, so I was able to reassure myself that we were safe. Then, something hit the gravel again, very close to us this time. They were rocks. Couldn't believe it. "What the heck?" I said. "It's rocks." I said this out loud, but somehow still kept my voice at a whisper. I got off of the swing and stepped back. I was scared the rocks were going to hit us. Since it was dark, I had no way of knowing if the rocks were heading towards the ground or my face. My sister was nervous too, but she was still sort of in denial. That is, until another rock came down and touched the wood chips, causing my sister to jump off of her swing as well. We both hid behind the metal poles of the playground structure. We both realized that the rocks were being thrown and they were being thrown by a person. This scared me even more. We didn't know who it was, how long they had been watching us, or why they were doing this. We started to frantically scan the area, trying to find this mysterious person. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the roof of the school. He was a tall figure and wearing some kind of clothing that hung down to his ankles. It looked like a cape or a trench coat. He had his hood up over his head. I couldn't see his face, but I assumed it was a man. I felt all the blood drain from the top half of my body. I couldn't stop looking at him. I was so confused. My sister screamed, "Oh Lord." When she saw him too, she let out a nervous giggle, and so did I. We both knew how scared we both were. The man just kept still. I felt kind of stupid for being scared. It was probably just a bored teenager messing with people. But when the next rock hit the pole right in front of us, I was scared again. I gathered my things and ducked out from under the playground structure. I held my hand in front of my face to protect myself from the rocks. Then we heard it, a bone-chilling, screechy, and loud scream coming from the man. We both gasped and looked up at him. My stomach dropped, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. It's like my fight or flight response kicked in. I felt cold and shaky. My sister and I ran away as fast as we could. We ran out of the gap in the fence and into the street. We kept running, looking behind us, expecting to see the man come sprinting after us. We eventually slowed down. My sister tried to break the tension by joking about him coming after us and making those noises again. I was crying and told her to stop talking about it because I was genuinely afraid. Thankfully, the man never came after us. We never had an encounter like this again. The weirdest part is that we never saw him again that night, even though we walked around the fields across from the school building. We never saw him on the roof or in the street. He was just gone. While we were able to make it out of the situation unharmed, the experience still scared us. It may have been a bored teenager who just wanted to pull a prank, but it's important to remember that your pranks and jokes might affect someone negatively. You never know how your actions might affect someone else, especially when they're feeling unsafe. A grisly discovery. I'm in my final year of police training. I'm training to be a detective specializing in murder and organized crime cases. Throughout my training, I've seen many gruesome things and read about many past cases. I'm not breaking any laws by talking about this case from the 1990s, right after the Soviet Union collapsed. Newly independent countries were trying to establish their governments and law enforcement systems. People were mostly poor and organized crime started to increase. Many mafia groups formed in bigger cities because there wasn't effective law enforcement to stop them. The law enforcement units that were formed were mostly corrupt and afraid of the mafia. I was born in a city that had one of the strongest and most influential mafia gangs in the country. The time from the 1990s to the early 2000s was like one big crime scene throughout the country. There were daily shootings, murders, robberies, and carjackings. You name it, and it was there. During my early training years in 2018, I went to the police archives and came across a few cases that will stay in my mind for a while. I'll tell you about one of those cases. In the early autumn of 1992, when it was still warm, a young man suddenly went missing. The police knew that he had some ties with the local mob. They weren't able to find him or his body for a week. While the search was going on, 3 teenage boys, aged 12 through 14, went fishing at a local river. There was a main road by the river, and there was a school by the main road. There was a trail leading through the school's playground to the riverbank. It was about a 3-minute walk from the playground to the river. The boys took their fishing gear. As they were walking through the playground, they waved to the school's principal, who was outside talking to a groundskeeper. The boys were known for their mischievous behavior at school, so the principal ignored them. The boys continued to the river. It was around 5 p.m. and still light out. The boys got ready to fish. 15 minutes passed, and nothing happened. One of the boys got impatient and recast his rod. Just as he started to reel it back, something heavy was on the line. He got excited and shouted to his friends that he thought he caught a fish. The other boys ran over to him and excitedly waited for the fish to surface. But as the boy continued reeling the line, their faces went pale. There was no fish on the line. Instead, the hook was stuck in human flesh. The boy threw up when he saw he had caught a human head. The boys panicked. They didn't know what to do, as there were no cell phones back then, and the closest building was the school. The boys dropped their gear and ran back to the school. They hoped to find the principal, who they had seen earlier. The principal wasn't outside, so the boys ran into the school and to his office. They screamed for the principal to come with them because there was something horrible by the river. The principal was confused and refused to go with them at first. He thought it was a prank. But when he noticed how pale and panicked they were, he said in a serious voice, "This better not be one of your silly pranks." The boys took him to the riverbank and showed him the head, which still had the hook in it. The principal stood in silence. He had a terrified look on his face. He quickly took the boys back to his office and called the police. The police came and, of course, the forensic team was called. They took statements from the boys and the principal. It turned out that the head belonged to the missing man. The 22-year-old was killed by the mob because he owed them money. His body was cut into several pieces and thrown into the river. Only his head and torso were ever recovered. When I read the case files 20 years later, I was brought to tears. How terrible it must have been for those boys to discover that head, and how terrible for the man's family to hear their son was found in pieces. I'm not faint-hearted, as I chose a career as a murder detective, but some cases and statements really get to me. This case gives me the motivation and strength to find and fight horrible people. Stay safe, everyone. The Intruder. Years ago, when I was 8 or 9, my family and I lived in a big old house on the edge of a small town in Pennsylvania. The local school district was going through a big restructuring, so even though my brother and I were only a couple of grades apart, we went to different schools and took different buses. This meant that I was the last person to leave the house every morning and the first person to get home every afternoon. It was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the doors were locked when I left for school. One morning, I noticed that the light was on in the basement and that the door was open. Before I left, I made sure the light was off and the door was locked. When I got home that afternoon, I saw that the basement light was on and the door was open again. I thought maybe I had imagined locking the door. I was pretty tired most mornings after staying up late playing video games, so it wasn't out of the question that I had just forgotten to do it. I went over to turn off the light and close the door, but when I got to the top of the basement staircase, I looked down to see a big, shadowy figure standing at the bottom. I freaked out. I slammed the door closed, pushed a cabinet in front of it, and ran upstairs to hide in my room. I didn't tell my family for months because I was convinced that I had seen a ghost, and I didn't think anyone would believe me. It was around Halloween, and I was young and believed in the paranormal. About 6 months after the incident, my parents realized that things had been going missing around the house. They blamed my brother and me at first, but we insisted that we were innocent. We walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how someone might have gotten inside without breaking in. It turns out that the thing I saw in the basement was a man, and he had been climbing in through a small hole on the outside of the house. He went through the crawl space and came up into the house through the basement. Recognizing that I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was terrifying. Needless to say, I don't believe in ghosts anymore. The Joyride. The year my mom passed away was a difficult one. The world was shutting down, and I felt like everything around me was falling apart. My friendships were fading, and I was mourning alone during the lockdown. That was until my neighbor, George, reintroduced himself to me. I was 18 and he was 21. We became friends, and he invited me to a bonfire with his other friends. The two I became closest with were named Peter and Aiden. Those two were a sight to behold. I had never seen two people who weren't married talk to each other as much as they did. No one complained about it, though, especially not their girlfriends. We all became friends quickly. They all came to my mom's funeral, even though they didn't know her. My childhood friends didn't even come to the funeral. The last Saturday before my freshman semester of college was coming up, and we all got together. It was raining unexpectedly, but we all wanted to have a few drinks and end the summer with a bang. Peter pitched an idea. He owned a beat-up old Jeep. His grandfather had given it to him, and he was planning on selling it the next day. Peter was trying to get me, George, and Aiden to take it out for one last joyride. I was hesitant when I got the hint that Peter didn't want his or Aiden's girlfriends to know about the joyride. Knowing that we had been drinking for over an hour, the roads were wet, and the Jeep had no doors or top, I was worried about the idea. I knew it was a bad idea, but I didn't want to be the youngest guy in the room telling everyone to be careful. I didn't want to kill the vibe of the party. This was when I made the worst decision of my life. Not only did I decide to keep my mouth shut, but I also tagged along. I was trying to act cool, but it was becoming clearer and clearer to me that my one friends were too drunk. Aiden and I got in the back of the Jeep. George sat in the passenger seat, and Peter was driving. As the ride went on, and the music continued to play, my worries began to fade. I started to have a good time. Suddenly, I looked over and saw that Aiden was standing up without his seatbelt on. I wasn't sure if George and Peter didn't notice, but they weren't doing anything about it. I tried to pull Aiden back down into his seat. My heart started beating fast as I realized we were going way over the speed limit. I could hear the tires splashing water up onto the pavement as we flew by. I was screaming at the top of my lungs to try to get George and Peter's attention, but they couldn't hear me over the music. Aiden wasn't listening. He was too drunk to understand how dangerous what he was doing was. While tugging on Aiden to get back down, I heard a funny noise coming from the tire. I looked back and saw that the Jeep was swinging back and forth. Before I knew it, our wheels locked up. I woke up with a ringing in my head. I slowly opened my eyes to the night sky. I heard mumbles and groans nearby. I looked up and saw that I was still in my seatbelt, but we were no longer on the road. We were hanging off of the road, with the Jeep smashed up against a guardrail. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stumbled out of the Jeep. I looked back and saw that George and Peter were in the front seats with their airbags deployed. I didn't see Aiden. I crouched down to look under the Jeep to see if he was on the ground on the other side, but I couldn't find him. I started to panic. Peter was screaming. His arm had been hanging out of the window when we crashed, and it nearly snapped in half. I could see his bone. I saw Peter, and his face was covered in cuts and small rocks. There were even shards of glass sticking out of him. I couldn't focus on my friends, though. I needed to find Aiden. I started screaming his name as loud as I could. The only thing illuminating the night was the Jeep's headlights. I didn't know what I was going to do if I found Aiden, but I knew I had to find him. I found him about 40 feet away from the Jeep, lying face down by a tree. I ran over to him and rolled him over. I started to scream and cry when I saw him. There was so much blood. It was like a fountain that never ended. I didn't know what to do, so I started wiping the blood away with my shirt. That didn't work. I then took my hand and began wiping the blood off of his face. The realization hit me. I wasn't just wiping blood off his face. I was wiping chunks of his face off. There was more than just blood on my hands. There were pieces of tissue and flesh. I scooted away and screamed as loud as I could. There was nothing I could do for Aiden. He was already gone. I don't sleep very much anymore. If I do, it's only about 3 to 5 hours a night. I don't talk to Peter and George much anymore. They eventually came to terms with what happened. We all made the decision to go on that joyride. There was no villain in this story, just dumb teenagers who made a life-ending decision because of peer pressure and alcohol. I hope you can learn from my story and don't have to learn from experience. A Discord story. A few years ago, I was part of a true scary story server on Discord. It was a place where people would share their own personal stories of scary or spooky things that had happened to them. For a while, it was a lot of fun. Sure, a lot of the stories seemed made up, but every so often, someone would share a story that was actually believable. Occasionally, these stories were genuinely terrifying. I read many spine-chilling stories on that server. I've forgotten a lot of them over the years. However, There's one story I'll never forget because it genuinely made me shudder when I read it. The person who posted the story began by assuring us that their story wasn't made up. They explained that their early years were scarred by tragedy. Their dad died of a drug overdose when they were young, so they were raised by their single mom. They lived in a small apartment down the street from their grandma's house. Their mom dated, obviously trying to find a stepdad and give the storyteller a father figure in their life. The incident in the story happened while the storyteller's mom was out on a date one night. Usually, the storyteller's grandma would babysit for them anytime their mom needed to go out. But on this particular night, the grandma was working. So, the 9 or 10-year-old storyteller was left unsupervised in their mom's ground floor apartment. It might sound irresponsible at first, but the storyteller reassured the members of the server that they were fine being left alone for an hour or two. They had their Yu-Gi-Oh cards and a box set of the cartoon to keep them occupied. The storyteller said they were sitting in the living room, playing with their cards, and watching TV when they heard a tapping on the window. Remember, they lived in a ground floor apartment, so anyone could have walked up and started tapping on the glass. There wasn't anything inherently creepy about that. The storyteller got up, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtains. To their surprise, they were met with the face of a complete stranger. Confused, the storyteller backed up from the window and let the curtains fall back into place. Suddenly, they heard glass smashing. The stranger broke the window. The storyteller threw their Yu-Gi-Oh cards on the floor and ran out of the back door of the apartment and over to their neighbor's place. They pounded on the door in terror, looking over their shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. The neighbor answered the door and let the storyteller inside. They called the cops. The cops came over immediately, and the neighbor got in touch with the storyteller's mom. Their mom came home and comforted the storyteller. Then, the neighbor and the storyteller's mom accompanied the storyteller back to the apartment, where the cops were still searching the property. One of the cops approached the mom and showed her something in a plastic bag. The mom turned pale, knelt down, and hugged the storyteller tight. The storyteller and their mom ended up staying at the grandma's house for a week while the window was repaired. The storyteller said they were too young at the time to realize what was going on, but they were suspicious as to why it took so long to fix the window and why they had to stay at their grandma's for an entire week. The danger they had been in didn't become clear until years later, when their mom explained to them what happened that night. It wasn't just the window that was being replaced. The apartment was also being fitted with new locks and security cameras. The whole family was terrified. It was all because of the evidence the cop showed the mom that night. It was a photograph of the storyteller, sleeping soundly in their bed. The storyteller's mom said the photo couldn't have been taken long before the attempted break-in, maybe a week before, because the sheets on the bed were fairly new. This meant that the stranger had broken into the apartment and taken the photograph a week prior. The storyteller's mom said she could only imagine the stranger had done that to other children. 2. She said they only felt safe again when they heard news that a man whose MO was similar to their own experience was caught by the police and jailed. They kept the whole thing a secret from the storyteller until they were a teenager. I had never read anything as horrifying as that on the Discord server. It made everything else seem tame in comparison. I stopped reading the server shortly afterward. It's weird how we seek out scary stories to give ourselves a little thrill but end up being genuinely traumatized by the real ones. The basement. This happened a year or two ago. I'm young and live in Southern California, in the San Diego area. I live with my family, including my older sister, Sarah. We had a cousin, who I'll call Ben, visiting us from out of the country. Since Sarah and Ben were close in age, she decided to be his tour guide, as he hadn't been to California since he was little. Sarah and Ben are big fans of pop culture, especially pop music. There was a famous pop singer performing in Los Angeles, and Sarah was a big fan. She bought tickets for her and Ben to go to the concert during his visit. First, I was a bit annoyed that I wasn't invited, as I was a fan too, but it didn't matter that much to me. I decided to invite 2 of my close friends, Jennifer and David, to come with us on the trip. I didn't have my license, but both Jennifer and David did. We could drive around Los Angeles after Sarah and Ben went to the concert. The five of us drove to Los Angeles together. Sarah and Ben sat in the front, and Jennifer, David, and I sat in the back. Despite being a casual fan of the artist, Sarah and Ben played their music on repeat the entire time we drove. With traffic, it was an easy 3-hour drive. The artist only had 3 albums out at the time, and one of them was very loud and a bit depressing. My friends and I liked softer, more rock-type music, so we got tired of it pretty quickly. Not only that, but both Sarah and Ben felt the need to screech the lyrics the whole time. Unfortunately, neither of them had the most pleasant voices. We got to Los Angeles around noon. We were all hungry and needed to use the restroom. Being in Los Angeles, it's difficult to find clean restrooms to use, as many aren't open to the public. You have to buy something in order to use the restroom. Finding food that we could all agree on also added to the stress. Ben had never had ramen before, as traditional Japanese food wasn't easy to find where he lived. Sarah was gluten-free due to health problems, and Jennifer had a severe peanut allergy. Sarah and Ben were totally in their own world, getting excited about the concert. Sarah ignored whatever my friends and I requested to do, and she played up the "I'm older than you" card. I was getting pretty annoyed with them and couldn't wait to drop them off at the concert venue. After we dropped them off, the rest of the night was fun. We went to Santa Monica and watched the sunset. We walked around a bit, and by the time we got hungry, we found a burger place on Yelp. We were looking for a place to park when a group of people who seemed to be gang members stood in front of the spot we were going to park in. They started approaching our car and putting their hands on the exterior while looking into the window. David was driving. Jennifer and I told him we needed to leave and find somewhere else to park. I've always been cautious, especially in Los Angeles, since I had a few unsavory experiences in the past. One time, a man followed me and my friend to our car, and we had to shove him out. So, we left and found a clear spot in a well-populated area a few blocks away. The food was great and all was well. I didn't realize until after we were done eating that we had been in the middle of Skid Row. For those who don't know, Skid Row is a neighborhood in downtown Los Angeles that's mostly home to homeless people. There are also a lot of drug dealers and sex workers around. My friends and I were walking back to the car when I looked up to one of the taller buildings on the block. The sign read, Hotel Cecil. The Cecil Hotel is an old hotel that was in its prime back in the 1920s and 1930s. But when the Depression struck, the hotel's reputation went downhill. It was known for housing homeless people, drug and sex workers, and a few infamous guests such as Richard Ramirez. The hotel is supposed to be vacant now, but as far as I could see, there was still activity going on inside. I don't believe in the paranormal, but I can definitely say that the place gave off creepy vibes. Once I realized where we were, my friends and I ran to the car. We saw people on the other side of the street looking into a parked car. They looked our way once we approached, but we were able to leave in time. Thankfully, nothing happened to us in Skid Row, but I was on edge a bit after that. We picked up some pie from a shop David liked, as it was on the way to the venue Sarah and Ben were at. We thought we had plenty of time, but Sarah called me and demanded that we come over immediately. I knew she was just being impatient, so we didn't hurry. We decided to finish our pies before going to the venue. Sarah kept texting me impatiently. Jennifer started feeling sick after eating her pie. There were peanuts in the crust, and she was allergic. We left quickly and tried to stop somewhere to get water and an antihistamine for Jennifer, as she didn't have her EpiPen. She started feeling a bit better, but she was still really sick. I was stressed and worried. Once we got to the venue, Sarah and Ben took forever to come out. They had waited to see if they could meet the artist. Once they came out, Jennifer and I went to the back seat. Sarah yelled at me for taking so long. We had to stop a few times so Jennifer could throw up. On top of that, Sarah and Ben continued to play the same artist on repeat, along with their videos from the concert. Of course, they were singing along too. I was so done. Jennifer was still sick. David was being aloof and I was stressed. We dropped Jennifer and David off first, as they lived on the way to our house. It was around 1 a.m. at this point. I was tired of the music and annoying conversation. Once the two left, I got out of the car and demanded that I drive for the rest of the trip. mostly so I could play my own music. Sarah argued about it, but she ultimately agreed to sit in the back seat. I was very on edge. I played my music as I drove us home, and everything seemed fine. It wasn't until I was almost home that something strange happened. Our house was off the major freeway. You have to pass a hilltop with houses on it and make a turn to get to our neighborhood. There's a cemented patch of grass between a stretch of concrete between the hill and the turn that's used as a divider between oncoming and ongoing traffic. As I was approaching the hill, I saw something that creeped me out. It was around 2 a.m. That area wasn't busy that late at night. On the grass divider and along the cement, there were people lined up. There were at least 15 people, and they were all wearing white. I could see them perfectly as my headlights were on, and they were easy to spot because of the brightness of their clothes. When I first came up to the hill, they were just standing around. Then, they started raising their voices and talking all at once. I could hear them through my car windows and over my music. They started running towards me, trying to get my attention. They followed along the side of my car as I turned onto the street. They were literally following me and talking to me. It was bizarre. I can't say for sure, but they were dressed similarly to KKK members, but I'm not sure if that's who they were. I had no clue what I saw, but I knew I did see something. I screamed and asked Sarah and Ben if they saw it too, but they had been sleeping. I know people sometimes create distractions like that to target drivers, so I wasn't sure what was going on. My town was small and conservative, so I guess it could have been the KKK, due to how they were dressed. There were also some occult members in the area, but not many these days. I was so creeped out. I drove around the block a few times before pulling into our street, even though we were right by our house. I was pretty sure they weren't following anymore, but I wasn't taking any chances. I told my mom about what happened, and I think she believed me to an extent. It does sound a bit absurd, but I know what I saw. My sister claims that it never happened. She even refuses to acknowledge that I was the one driving. It makes me feel a bit crazy, but I know I was the one driving. Be careful when you go out of town, especially to a place like Los Angeles. You can expect some weird encounters. The Stalker. I'm in my 30s and work as a journeyman electrician. I often work alone in people's homes, so I frequently find myself in interesting situations. I'm a small woman, only 5 feet 2 inches and about 125 pounds. I'm aware of my limitations in physically dangerous situations. I served in the military, so I have rudimentary knowledge of hand-to-hand combat. I'm also adept at using concealed weapons. I have experience as a paramedic in a major city, so I feel as prepared as I can be. This story is about an experience with a man I call the man with the mannequin legs. To protect his privacy, I'll call him Dylan. One Friday, almost 2 years ago, around 7:30 p.m., I had already worked a long day and was ready to go home when I received an emergency dispatch to an apartment complex. I grumbled, as it was a Friday night, and I wanted to go home, but I went to the apartment. The dispatch was for a loss of power in one of the older, lower-income buildings. As soon as I saw the building, I had a gut feeling that I should proceed with caution. I had an overwhelming sense of anxiety and trepidation, which was unusual. I decided to trust my gut. I texted my office manager, my boyfriend, and my mom my location. I told them that if they didn't hear from me every 20 minutes, they should call the police. When I rang the doorbell of the apartment, a gruff voice demanded to know who was there. I told him I was the electrician, and he buzzed me in. I walked up the stairs, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It smelled like unwashed bodies, old cigarette butts, and stale alcohol. The man opened his door, and the smell intensified. He wore dirty clothes that didn't fit him very well. His face was thin and unshaven. I asked him for details about the power outage. He explained that some things worked while others didn't. I won't bore you with the details, but I had to check his electrical panel. I told him I needed to run out to my truck to grab a different screwdriver. When I went back out to the truck, I grabbed my concealed weapon. He led me to his bedroom. I picked my way across a sea of discarded items. We passed the kitchen. The sink was stacked high with dirty dishes, and there was rotting food precariously balanced on top.
I stepped over kloting.
garbage, and alcohol containers. There were burn marks in the carpet. When we got to the bedroom, I saw a mattress with a tattered blanket on it. There were no sheets or pillows. In the center of the bed was the top half of a dirty mannequin. I tripped over something on the floor. It was a pair of mannequin legs that had been crudely detached from the rest of the body. There was a hole drilled between the legs. There were lines drawn on the legs at the joints. It was a creepy sight. I also noticed a red light flashing at the man's ankle. It was a GPS ankle monitor. My anxiety increased. The man led me to his closet to see the electrical panel. I had to turn my back to him to make the repairs. He watched me, smoking a cigarette, drinking from a brown paper bag, and occasionally looming over me. Suddenly, he came out of the bathroom and said something to me, making me jump. I told him what was wrong with his electrical panel and told him I'd have to come back another time to make the repairs. I wasn't going to spend the night at his apartment. I made it clear to him that he should expect me to come back the following week. I left and headed to the supply store. I texted my friends and family and told them how uncomfortable I was. My office manager told me she'd understand if I didn't want to finish the repairs, but I didn't want to put that on another coworker. So I agreed to go back and finish my job. I got the supplies and went back to the apartment. I still had my weapon on me. I made a few temporary repairs and told him I'd have to come back again. I stressed that the repairs would probably only last a week. I told him the panel needed to be replaced and I would send him an estimate. If there was a time for him to act on nefarious plans, now was the time. I got out my invoice. I had my folding knife in my pocket. Thankfully, he didn't do anything threatening. He filled out a check for the amount due. As I was leaving, he thanked me and watched me walk to my truck. I jumped in my truck and locked the doors. I finally felt safe until I saw him in my rearview mirror, staring at me. I left quickly and drove a few blocks away to calm down. I shook as the adrenaline left my system. I reassured my family that I was safe, and I told my office manager that I couldn't go back to that apartment. Within 10 minutes of leaving, the office manager contacted me and told me that Dylan had already booked another appointment for the following week. I told her that I hadn't even sent the estimate yet. That Monday, I prepared the estimate and, with my office manager's permission, I overestimated the price. I estimated it to be 3 times what it should cost. I hoped he wouldn't ask me to come back, but no such luck. Within 10 minutes of sending the estimate, my office manager called and said that Dylan accepted the estimate and wanted to keep his appointment for the following week. I begged my office manager not to make me go back. Instead, she offered to send me back with another person. My heart dropped. I looked up Dylan's name on the internet to see if I could find a reason not to go back to his place. I found an article about him. Turned out he had just gotten out of prison. He served 2 years in prison for stalking a woman he met at a breakfast place. He held her hostage and threatened to kill her. I was so scared. The article didn't say how the situation with the woman ended, but she was able to get away, and Dylan was arrested. He spent 2 years in prison and was on 5 years of probation. He had been released in the last year. I thought back to the last week and remembered 2 occasions where a beat-up car had been following me. I wasn't sure if it was him, but looking back, probably was. I didn't think he'd be able to find me on the internet, as I have a common name, and I have all my privacy settings on social media as strict as possible. I never post anything that will reveal my location. I guess that's why he was never able to find me. I made sure a do not service order was placed on his name and address. My company stood behind me and protected me. They removed my name and photo from the website, and they randomized my schedule so I never started and finished my day anywhere near Dylan's apartment. I never went back to his apartment, but I did end up with a scary story. No matter how prepared you are for a situation, you never know what you're going to face. Trust your instincts. The Haunting. This story took place in the autumn of 2014. I'm not sure what would have happened if my mom hadn't heard this person, but I'm grateful she did. To give you a better understanding of the events I'm about to describe, I'll explain the layout of my house. There are 3 entrances: the front door, the side door, and the back door, which was located in my bedroom at the time. The back door has a glass window that gives a good view of the backyard. The side door is located at the end of the driveway, next to the garage. To the right of the garage is the backyard. Unfortunately, there wasn't a gate to the backyard at the time, but this incident led to us putting one up. One night, around 2 o'clock or 3 a.m., I was watching YouTube on my tablet. I was startled by a light illuminating the garage door. Before I even turned my head to look, I assumed the light was coming from a flashlight and grabbed my weapon from under my bed. It wasn't uncommon for the neighbor to come into our yard looking for his cat, so I decided to wait and see who was in the yard. It was a good thing I did too, because the flashlight was attached to a weapon held by a police officer. Confused, I left my bedroom, expecting to see my mom sitting on the couch. Instead, I saw her on her tiptoes, looking out the window at the officer, who was slowly creeping up the driveway. I asked her what was going on. Apparently, a homeless person had snuck into our backyard and accidentally kicked over our recycling bin, alerting my mom, who was in the basement doing laundry. She saw them through the basement window. They must have seen her too, because by the time she was able to call the police, they were gone. The cop told us that no one was in the garage or the backyard. I could feel the anxiety lift off my mother's shoulders, especially after the officer offered to send someone over to watch the house until sunrise. If the homeless person had taken 1 or 2 more steps into our yard, they would have seen me in my room, and I would have been none the wiser. I'm much more cautious now. We've installed several security cameras, a fence in the backyard, and motion detector lights. The sleep paralysis demon. I'm 23 and live alone. Sleep paralysis and night terrors are common for me, to the point where I can recognize them instantly and break free from them on my own. However, a few nights ago, I experienced something different. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw that it was around 4 a.m. I'm a light sleeper, so waking up randomly like this is common for me. I sighed, as I knew my alarm would go off in 2 hours, and I should try to fall back asleep. I tried meditating, but I just couldn't go back to sleep. I decided I should at least rest my eyes. I curled up on my side on my queen-sized bed, facing the edge. Suddenly, I felt the mattress sink behind me, like someone sat on the bed. I opened my eyes and froze in fear. I felt the spot on the mattress shift, and I heard the sheets shuffle. The person was scooting closer to me on the bed. I closed my eyes and tried to control my breathing. I told myself that if I could convince them I was asleep, they'd leave me alone. I felt the person move closer and closer to me until they touched my back. I held in a gasp and didn't open my eyes. I was so scared. Then they retreated back to their spot on the bed. I let out a sigh of relief, pretending it was just a sleeping grunt. I slowly opened my eyes but didn't move. I looked around the room. It's not real, I thought. I'm just dreaming. I was convinced I was dreaming because I knew if there was an intruder, I wouldn't react the way I was. Put up a fight, try to escape, or scream for help. But that didn't make sense because I could still feel the spot in my bed behind me sink. I looked around the room again. My room looked normal. It didn't have that weird, off look that rooms and dreams usually have. So I had to be awake. Then, all of a sudden, I felt a tug on my duvet. I flinched and closed my eyes, but it was too late. The person started pulling my duvet violently. I screamed and kicked and cried, trying to keep the duvet over myself. I didn't open my eyes to see who it was, as I was too scared. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I opened my eyes. It was light outside. I sat up and looked around. There was no sign of a struggle. There were no tears on my face. I was sweating, and my heart was beating fast. What was that? I wondered. Whenever I dream about my room, I notice that something is off about it once I wake up. But this time, everything was normal. I was so confused. Perhaps I was looking at my room in reality, but my brain slipped into a dream state. I don't know, but I'm open to any explanations you might have. The Evil Valley. When I was in middle school, my family moved into my mom's childhood home to take care of my grandpa. The property was located in the woods near Lake Michigan. Everyone referred to the area as the Valley. I grew up hearing scary stories about the valley from my aunts, uncles, and cousins. Once we moved in, we quickly learned why the valley was the most evil place we had ever been. At the time, my mom was working third shift while my dad ran his own business out of the garage. One night, I needed to talk to my dad, but he wasn't in the house. I knew he was probably working in the garage, so I went outside to check. I saw that the lights were on in the garage, and I could hear the radio playing. I ran across the yard to the garage. When I got to the garage door, I realized something was wrong. It was completely silent. I didn't see my dad anywhere. I know I heard the radio playing just moments ago, but now all I could hear was my own breathing. I ran back to the house as fast as I could. I went inside and found my dad in the living room, looking as if he'd been there for hours. This was just one of many horrifying experiences that happened at that house. I didn't think much of it and moved on. It wasn't until we moved out a few years later that I was reminded of the experience. My family often told scary stories about the valley, and one night, it was my brother's turn to tell a story. I quickly realized that his story sounded familiar. He described the same instance of needing to talk to our dad. He saw the lights on and heard the radio playing in the garage. He ran out there but found nothing. There was one detail my brother added that terrified me. He said that when he turned back towards the house, he saw a figure on the roof. It looked like a man. The silhouette was so dark, it was contrasted against the surrounding woods. My brother ran back to the house. After hearing his version of events, I couldn't help but wonder if I had looked up. Would I have seen the figure too? The playground incident. I went to a small junior school in the UK. There were only about 100 kids in the entire school. The playground was tiny too, only about 50 meters across. This meant that if something happened on the playground, everyone would see it. I suppose this was good for the teachers, but it wasn't good for me the day something happened to Lewis. One day, we were all playing in the playground when I heard one of the teaching assistants scream, "Lewis! Lewis!" I remember it was autumn because I was playing with fallen leaves when I heard the scream. I turned around to see the teaching assistant kneeling down by Lewis, who was lying on the concrete. Blood was pouring out of his mouth. I was horrified. He was unconscious, and his eyes had rolled up into their sockets. Many of us went into the coat room. Some kids were crying, and others were pale and in shock. I thought Lewis was dead. The afternoon classes were canceled. Everyone was too distraught to concentrate. We were kept in our classrooms until we were called into the main assembly hall to hear news about Lewis. We weren't given all the details, only that Lewis had fallen, hit his head, and was taken to the hospital. We were told that he was okay, but that he would be out of school for a week. Lewis came back sooner than we expected. The first day he was back, we all gathered around him as he showed off his scar. He had also lost a few baby teeth, which I guess was lucky, as he was about to lose them anyway. The incident was definitely the scariest thing I had ever seen. It's been about 25 years, but I still remember the whole thing clearly. Those eyes, the whites of his eyes, are something I'll never forget. The twins' house. I have an aunt who lives in a haunted house. It was built in the late 1800s. The house has a weird setup. It's technically two identical houses joined together as one big house. According to my mom, the house was originally owned by twin sisters. Each sister lived on her own side of the house, and the two sides connected through a staircase in the attic. Legend has it that the twins had an uncle who abused them. One of the twins got pregnant and had a baby. The other twin smothered the baby, and then both twins took their own lives. Strangely, almost every family member who has slept at the house has left with a story to tell. Unfortunately, I have two stories from this house. The first incident happened the summer after I graduated 8th grade. My older cousin was getting married out of state. My aunt and I went to the wedding. We had an early flight to catch, so my aunt suggested I spend the night at her house. I asked if I could sleep in her room. When she asked why, I told her it was because the house was haunted. As usual, she shrugged it off and told me there were no ghosts. But She said I could sleep in her room if it made me feel better. As night approached, I took some sleeping medicine, hoping it would help me fall asleep before my aunt. It didn't work, though. My aunt fell asleep, and I lay wide awake and scared. A couple of hours passed, and nothing happened. I started to relax a little. Then, out of nowhere, the closet doorknob started frantically turning, as if someone was trying to get out. I immediately sat up, wide awake and panicked. I stayed awake the rest of the night watching the closet door. I'm not sure who or what was trying to open the closet, but I'm glad nothing ever did. The second incident happened years later, the summer after I graduated college. I was staying at my aunt's house again, as we were traveling out of town the next day, and my aunt thought it would be better if I slept there so we could catch our early flight. I went to the room where I'd be sleeping. It was down the hall from my aunt's room. I closed the door, put on my pajamas, and sat down in the recliner in front of the TV. A couple of hours passed, and nothing happened. As soon as it turned 3 a.m., I started to hear what sounded like heeled shoes walking around. Whatever it was, it walked up the stairs, down the hall, and stopped right outside my room. I jumped up and pushed the daybed in front of the door to prevent whatever it was from getting inside. The walking continued. It would start from the base of the stairs, go up the stairs, and down the hall. Each time, it stopped right outside the door to my room. I was scared, despite barricading the door closed. To lighten up the atmosphere, I turned on a channel that had stand-up comedy and tried to watch, but I was still scared. The walking continued for an hour. Eventually, it stopped, but I kept the door barricaded. I didn't open the door until the morning. Needless to say, I haven't been back to sleep over at my aunt's house since. The grocery store stalker. I work at a small organic grocery store with many strange customers. We get a lot of conspiracy theorists who, for some reason, always want to talk to me. Those people are weird and sometimes get one a bit aggressive when I don't respond to them, but they don't scare me. I'm lucky to work at a store with a wonderful group of managers who have no problem taking over a situation if it gets out of hand. However, there is one guy who scares me. He rarely talks to me. He's a regular, one of the many homeless people who stop by every now and then. Most of them are lovely people, if a little strange, but not this man. He works at a store nearby and lives in his car, so he'll often stop by multiple times a day. He said a multitude of crazy things to my coworkers. One time, he told one of my coworkers that because he wasn't white, he was the son of the Antichrist. I heard him growl at my coworker once because he had to swipe his card twice to get it to work. Even customers have complained about him saying weird things to them. The worst thing he does is stand and stare at us, the employees. Sometimes, he'll just stand in front of the checkout lines, not holding anything, not wanting to check out. He just stands still and stares at us. It's starting to scare me. The staring and the weird comments were bad enough, but one incident made me fearful of him. I had gotten off work early and was doing some grocery shopping around 8 p.m., an hour before closing. There were few people in the store, and, of course, our creepy friend was there. We have many names for him, but I mostly call him Squinty, as he's always squinting and staring at people. I swear, every time I looked behind me, he was following me into that aisle. Started to hurt my stomach. I got what I needed and left as fast as I could. Later on, my manager convinced me to let him send in a report so they could look at the security footage. Ever since then, Squintus' behavior has gotten scarier. One night, he came in at exactly 8:45 p.m. He had been coming in nearly every day for years. He knew what time we closed. He also knew that I almost always close in the evenings. It was right as I was about to count my till, and I swear, as soon as I turned around, he was standing at the entrance, staring me down. My manager walked me to the office, and Squinted didn't move until I was in the room. I had the store manager walk me to my car. He wasn't the most sensitive person and wanted to see the best in everyone, but even he was telling me that Squinted never comes in that late. As I was putting things into my car, the manager said, "Oh, that's weird." I looked up, and there Squinty was, standing by his car, staring at me. Once he saw that I saw him, he slowly got into his car and just sat there, not moving. He didn't follow me out of the parking lot. but I still took backroads home, just to be safe. I felt safe and grateful for my managers, who told Squinty to sit in the office until he left so he couldn't see me. Then, the other night, close to closing, I turned around to get some bags ready, and there he was, standing outside the window, staring at me. I was shocked, and of course, at that moment, I had a rush of customers. My manager was on break, the store manager was in the back, and the other employees were young females working alone. I told my manager I needed to go to the back. As I did, Squinty came up to the front and stood in front of my register, staring at me. I turned off my light, and my manager turned hers on. I finished the transaction I was working on, and Squinty stayed there, not moving. As soon as I finished, I ran to the cash office. He was there for another 20 to 30 minutes before leaving. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but every time he enters the store, my stomach drops. He's barely ever spoken to me. But I feel like he knows I reported him and that I'm afraid of him. Recently, he said that he often runs out of his medication at the end of the month. As I'm writing this, it's the middle of February. If this is how he's acting on his meds, I'm afraid of what's going to happen when he's off them. The creek. When I was a young teenager, my friend Nicholas and I would often take my family's sea kayak to a small creek that was about half a kilometer away from an abandoned golf course. The creek was slow-moving, so there was often a lot of garbage and debris at the mouth of the creek. Nicholas and I spent a lot of time at the creek. We even built a small jetty to tie the kayak to. The golf course was eerie. There were no animals or insects, and every noise was echoed back from the nearby cliff face. The closest thing we saw to an animal was a kangaroo skeleton. We found it around the second time we went to the creek. It was strange, as we had only been there a week prior, and there was no corpse. Yet there it was, a full skeleton. We picked up the bones, examined them, and then tossed them aside. I took the skull home and put it on my bookshelf. The next time we went to the creek, we decided to try exploring it as far down as we could. We armed ourselves with machetes and a small hatchet. The journey was difficult, as there were vines, sunken logs, and riverweed. The water was full of garbage. We finally made it to an area that was relatively garbage-free. I looked down and saw what I thought was a doll's head. I stopped paddling and looked closer. It was definitely a doll's head, a few inches below the surface of the water. I felt panicked when I saw it. Before I could say anything, Nicholas exclaimed, "Ah, cool!" He plunged his hand into the water to get it. He had to reach down a bit, but he got it. He lifted the head out of the water and looked at me, grinning. I took the head from him reluctantly. It was small and sun-damaged. The eyes were a disturbing shade of blue. I shook my head at Nicholas and put the head on the kayak. Nicholas laughed. "Let's call him Bob," he said. I gave him a deadpan look. "You're so original," I said. I turned back around and started paddling again. I stopped when I saw that Bob was staring back at me. I hadn't placed him like that. I had placed him facing outward. Nicholas was still paddling. We hit a submerged tree and came to a stop. Everything on the kayak jumped forward except Bob. He didn't move an inch. Nicholas started to say something, but I snapped at him to be quiet. He asked what was wrong, and I pointed to Bob. I told him that Bob didn't move. Nicholas scooted forward to get a better look. "What do you mean?" he asked. I hit the tree again with my paddle. Everything on the kayak moved except Bob. "That's weird," Nicholas said. I reached out and turned Bob around. "Let's go home," I said. Nicholas agreed, and we turned the kayak around. I watched the head like a hawk. Bob never looked back at me on the trip home. When we got back, we packed everything into our backpacks. I stuffed Bob into my pocket. I hadn't told Nicholas how creeped out I was because I was afraid he was going to make fun of me or play a prank on me. He was my best friend, and I knew he would do that. So, I decided to just keep my mouth shut. As we were walking home, my pocket started to feel warm. Each time I thought it couldn't get any warmer, it did. It wasn't burning, but it was hot. We put the kayak away and went upstairs for dinner. I went to my room and dumped Bob onto my bed. I left my room to join my family for dinner. Later that night, When Nicholas and I came back to my room to go to sleep, Bob was gone. I wasn't concerned, in fact, I was relieved. However, I had a feeling that he was still around. Not watching me exactly, but he was there. Nicholas climbed up to the top bunk and fell asleep. I lay in bed, pulled the blankets over me, and fell asleep quickly. The next day, I was awoken by the sounds of thumping coming from outside. I got up to look out the window and saw my stepfather using the hatchet to hack at a tree stump. I rubbed my eyes and turned around. I froze when I saw what was on my bookshelf. There, on the shelf in front of the kangaroo skull, was Bob. His eyes were looking directly at me. I turned to look at Nicholas, who was still sleeping, and jumped up to punch him in the arm. He woke up and looked at me. "What the heck, man?" he asked. "Oh, like you don't know," I said with a slight laugh. Nicholas looked at me, confused. I pointed to the bookshelf. "You didn't put it there?" I asked. Nicholas shook his head. "Nah, man. I would have had him facing outward anyway." I spun my head around. Bob was now facing the kangaroo skull. I started shaking and fell to the floor. I took Bob to the kitchen and threw him in the trash. Nicholas came into the kitchen. "Yeah, that thing was creepy," he said. I asked him again if he had put the head on the shelf. He swore that he didn't do it. I believed him. Months passed. Nicholas and I never had the chance to go back to the creek. Then, school holidays approached. I wanted to get all my chores out of the way, so I worked with my stepfather on various projects around the house. We used the machetes and hatchet that Nicholas and I had taken to the creek. One day, as I was working, I saw my mom pick something up off the ground. It was in the front yard, below the wheelie bins. I didn't think anything of it. A few hours later, I went inside to get a drink of water and change my shirt. When I walked into my room, I immediately felt strange. I looked at the bookshelf. There, on the shelf, was Bob, staring at me again. I went out to the kitchen. "Mom," I asked, "did you put something on my shelf?" "Yeah, I found that doll's head in the front yard earlier. I saw it in your room a long time ago and figured you must have lost it." 1. This made no sense to me. Mom couldn't have seen it in my room. There was no time. I shook my head and went back to my room. When I got there, I went to grab Bob, but he wasn't there. I looked all over for him, but I couldn't find him anywhere. I grabbed the phone and called Nicholas to tell him what happened. We were both speechless. My stepfather came inside. He asked me where I had put the hatchet. I was confused, as I had left it outside. We went outside to look for it, but it was gone. I never saw Bob again, but the story isn't over yet. Years later, when Nicholas and I were in our 20s, we decided to go back to the creek for old time's sake. We took the kayak out of the garage. It took us about an hour to get there. When we arrived, we were surprised to see that the jetty was still there. We tied the kayak to it and got out. My foot kicked something, and I looked down. It was the hatchet. Nicholas and I looked at each other. We felt a heavy presence around us. We turned to look at the water. There was a bloated cow floating in the creek. A storm was coming in. We knew it was time to leave. The tornado. When I was a kid, my family moved from upstate New York to North Carolina because of my dad's job. Moving was a scary experience for someone so young. It was difficult and sad to leave behind my friends and settle in a new place. One day at school, the weather was pretty bad, so we weren't able to go outside for recess, which wasn't unusual for that time of year. As the day went on, the rain got heavier. It was pounding against the windows so hard that our teacher had to raise her voice to be heard. Another teacher came into the classroom and whispered something in our teacher's ear. Our teacher's eyes went wide. We didn't know what was going on, but we could feel something bad was about to happen. Class continued, and the weather continued to worsen. Our teacher kept looking out the windows. I looked out to see what she was looking at. There was a bunch of stuff flying around outside, like paper and plastic. I had never seen anything like that before. Then, the intercom in our classroom came on, saying that all teachers and students needed to take shelter in the hallway immediately. We went out to the hallway with our teacher, who was struggling to remain calm. We sat down on the floor. We could all hear the wind howling outside. Our classroom was right next to the library. We heard a loud crashing sound coming from the library. It was so loud that everyone screamed. Then, we heard howling wind noises echo down the hallway. It honestly sounded like a monster was in the library. Some of the other kids started crying uncontrollably. We stayed in the hallway for hours. It was dark out by the time the howling noises stopped. We were so relieved when our parents came to pick us up. When I saw my parents at the entrance, I ran up to them and gave them a hug. I was so thankful that they were safe. As it turns out, the school had been hit by a tornado. It wasn't the worst kind of tornado, but it was strong enough to blow out the windows of the library. It was the scariest thing that had ever happened to me.